There is a wound on the face of the sun right now, a black yawning gash roughly the size of 50 Earths, and it is pointed directly at us. No flare, no explosion, no warning shot, just a silent, invisible river of charged particles pouring out of it at over 600 kilometers per second, and it has been quietly hammering our planet for 14 straight days. NOAA just issued a G2 Geomagnetic storm watch, but here is the part they are not telling you on the evening news. This thing is not a one-time hit. It is a recurring weapon that comes back every 27 days like clockwork. Stick with me, because the real story is not the solar wind stream. It is what happens when it keeps returning. If this has you hooked, hit like and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because you'll want to be here to see what the next data shows. Drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching this from, what time it is there, and your honest answer to this. If your GPS, your phone signal, your power grid, and 11,800 satellites are all being slow-cooked by something that returns on a 27-day schedule, how many rotations do you think the system can really take before something critical gives way? Let me know what you think. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The hit that shouldn't exist. There was no flare, there was no explosion, there was no glowing arc of plasma ripping itself off the surface of the sun and hurling itself across 93 million miles of empty space toward our planet. By every dramatic measure that usually gets the internet screaming about solar doom, the sun looked calm. It looked almost boring. And yet, sitting in an office in Boulder, Colorado, a team of forecasters at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Space Weather Prediction Center did something they do not do lightly. They issued a geomagnetic storm watch at the G2 level, a storm warning, without a storm, without anything visible at all. If you are watching this and you have spent any time following solar activity, you already know that something is off about that sentence. A G2 storm watch is not a small thing. It is the kind of advisory that utility companies read. It is the kind of advisory that satellite operators forward to their engineers. It is the kind of advisory that tells you Earth's magnetic field is about to get punched. And here is the strange part. This particular punch is arriving without a fist. No coronal mass ejection. No solar flare crackling across the disk of the sun. All the recent ejections that the sun has produced in the last several days have been pointed anywhere except at us. So if there is no eruption, and there is no blast, and there is no plasma cloud, then what exactly is NOAA so worried about? The answer starts with the numbers, and the numbers are doing something strange. The solar wind, the steady stream of charged particles that flows outward from the sun at all times, has been sitting at a relatively calm background speed of around 340 kilometers per second. That is normal. That is the quiet hum of the sun on an average day. But within a matter of hours, forecasters are expecting that wind to surge past 600 kilometers per second, possibly climbing all the way to 700. That is nearly double, and it is happening without any of the usual warning signs we look for. Meanwhile, the KP index, which is the scale scientists use to measure global geomagnetic disturbance, has been sitting near zero. It has been, by all conventional measures, one of the calmest stretches of geomagnetic weather you could ask for. And then, in under 12 hours, the forecast jumps that value from a near flatline reading to a KP of 6. A KP6 is an active storming magnetosphere. A KP6 is when auroras start pushing down into latitudes that do not usually see them. A KP6 is when your GPS gets a little flaky and your power grid operators start paying closer attention than they did the day before. And this kind of transition, this fast, this violent without a coronal mass ejection driving it, is rare. It is the kind of rapid shift that typically requires a solar blast wave slamming into our magnetic field. Except there is no blast wave, there is no cloud. There is only what forecasters are calling a clean high-speed stream event, and that word clean is doing a lot of work. Because the source of this storm is not an eruption at all, the source is something that has been sitting quietly on the face of the sun for days, growing, widening, rotating around into position. The source is a coronal hole, and I'm going to explain what that actually means in a moment, because most people get it wrong. But before we get there is a piece of this story that has not been making the headlines, and it changes everything about how you should think about what is coming. Because while everyone was watching for flares and CMEs, the radiation environment around Earth was already getting hammered. For 14 straight days, the flux of high-energy electrons in the outer radiation belt, the particles measured above 2 megaelectron volts, has been elevated above the 1,000 particle flux unit threshold. 14 days, that is not a spike, that is not a pulse, that is a sustained, relentless bombardment. And the peaks over the recent days have climbed to somewhere between 1700 and 3200 PFU. If those numbers feel abstract, let me put it in plain language. When you are a satellite sitting in orbit and the space around you is filled with high-energy electrons for days on end, those electrons do not just pass through you. They burrow into your insulation, they build up inside your components, they accumulate, and at some point, that accumulated charge has to go somewhere. It discharges, it arcs, it fries circuits, it flips memory bits, it can cause an instrument to malfunction in ways that look, from the ground, like a random anomaly. And the longer the exposure lasts, the more likely that discharge becomes. What we are seeing right now, before the high-speed stream even arrives, is a system that has been preloaded. The satellites that orbit Earth are already soaking in a radiation bath, and in the next few hours, they are about to get hit with the stream itself. This is the part that gets glossed over. Because this is not a one-shot event. This is not a cloud of plasma that sweeps past us in 12 hours, and then we are done. A high-speed stream from a coronal hole lasts for 3 to 5 days, sometimes longer. You get the initial compression, you get the disturbance, and then you get day after day of elevated solar wind, day after day of electron flux enhancement, day after day of a magnetosphere that cannot settle. And here is the part that really should make you pause. The same structure that is about to hit us right now hit us 27 days ago. And before that, 27 days before that, it is a pattern, it is predictable, it is written into the rotation of the sun itself. And somehow, despite being predictable, despite being recurring, despite being measurable and trackable and modelable, it is a threat that most people have never heard of. Modern infrastructure runs on satellites. Your phone's location services, the timing signals that keep financial markets synchronized, the communications that route emergency services, the weather forecasts that tell farmers when to plant and airlines when to fly, all of it depends on a fragile constellation of machines drifting through a hostile environment. And that environment right now is being stressed by something most of the public has never heard of, by something that does not look dramatic on a sunspot image, by something that keeps coming back on a schedule, and by something that the more we study it, the more it looks like it might not be a one-time problem at all. It might be the start of a pattern that is only just beginning to reveal itself. Part 2. The coronal hole misconception. If you pull up an extreme ultraviolet image of the sun right now, the kind that NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory produces, you'll see something that looks wrong. There is a dark region sprawled across the solar disk, an inky patch that seems to interrupt the glowing plasma surface, as if something has been scooped out of the sun itself. People look at these images and they assume the obvious. They assume it is damage, they assume it is a wound, they assume that somehow something has gone missing from the sun. And I get it. The language does not help. We literally call these things coronal holes. The word hole implies absence. It implies a gap. It implies that there is nothing there. But that is not what is happening. Let me say this plainly. A coronal hole is not a hole. There is no absence of material. There is no missing chunk of sun. The sun is still there, burning, churning, fusing hydrogen into helium at 15 million degrees Celsius in its core, exactly the way it has been for 4.5 billion years. What you are looking at when you see that dark region is not a gap in the sun. It is a gap in the way the sun's magnetic field is behaving. And once you understand that, you understand everything about why this threat keeps coming back and why it is so different from anything else the sun throws at us. Here is the part that most explanations skip. The sun has a magnetic field, and that magnetic field is not one uniform thing. It is a tangled, chaotic, constantly shifting web of magnetic lines that loop out from the surface, arc through the atmosphere, and return back down. In most places on the sun, these magnetic field lines are closed. They come out of one spot, they curve through the corona, and they dive back into another spot nearby, like rubber bands. Like the magnetic field of a bar magnet, where the lines loop from one pole to the other. And when magnetic field lines are closed like that, they act like cages. They trap the hot plasma of the sun's corona. They hold it in place. They make it dense, and dense plasma glows brightly in extreme ultraviolet light, which is why most of the sun looks bright when you image it. But in a coronal hole, the magnetic field lines are not closed. They are open. They come out of the sun, and instead of looping back down, they stretch outward, reaching into space, extending across the solar system. There is no cage. There is no trap. There is nothing holding the plasma in. And when plasma is sitting on top of an open magnetic field line, it does the only thing it can do. It flows outward. It streams away from the sun, following the field line, pouring into the solar system at speeds that can exceed 800 kilometers per second. It is not being launched. It is not being ejected. It is simply being released. So the reason a coronal hole looks dark is not because the sun is missing. It is because the plasma that would normally be there has already left. It has drained away through those open magnetic field lines. The region has lower density. It has lower temperature. It emits less light in the wavelengths we're observing. And so on our screens it looks black. A hole. A void. When in reality it is something much stranger. It is an open gate. It is a magnetic highway. It is, if you want the most accurate metaphor, an exhaust vent of the sun. A place where the solar atmosphere has found a way out, and is taking it continuously, day after day, as long as the magnetic structure holds. And this is where things get interesting, because coronal holes are stable. A coronal mass ejection, by contrast, is an event. It happens once, it erupts, it blasts off, it sweeps through space, and it is gone. Hours later, the sun has moved on. But a coronal hole is a structure. It is a feature of the solar magnetic field that can persist for weeks. It can persist for months. There are coronal holes that have been tracked for multiple solar rotations, appearing, disappearing around the far side of the sun, and then reappearing on the near side 27 days later, still pouring out their high-speed wind, still feeding the solar system with particles. The coronal hole that is aimed at us right now is not new. It has been there. It has been doing this. We just did not notice until it lined up with Earth. And that alignment matters, because the solar wind does not spray out in all directions equally. It streams along those open magnetic field lines, which means it flows in a specific direction, anchored to the location of the hole on the sun's surface. For that wind to reach Earth, the coronal hole has to be positioned so that its output is aimed at our orbital path. And thanks to the sun's rotation, that alignment is temporary, lasting a few days at a time before the sun rotates the hole out of our line of fire. But when the rotation brings it back around 27 days later, the alignment happens again, and the wind comes again, and the storm comes again. What I want you to hold on to is the contrast between how this energy is released versus how a CME releases its energy. A coronal mass ejection is an explosion. It is sudden, it is violent, it dumps an enormous amount of material in a short amount of time and then it is over. A coronal hole is the opposite. It is a leak. It is a steady, continuous, almost patient outflow of particles that never quite stops while the structure is active. You do not get a single punch. You get a 14-day hydrofracking operation on Earth's magnetic field. And because it is quiet, because it does not flash, because it does not produce the kind of dramatic imagery that gets people sharing links on social media, it is easy to overlook. But here is the thing. The sun is not the trigger. Not really. The sun is just the source. The real action, the thing that actually slams into our magnetic field and causes the storm, does not happen at the sun at all. It happens out in space, somewhere between here and there, in a region that most people have never heard of, where two very different types of solar wind are about to collide. And that collision, that specific feature of how fast wind interacts with slow wind, is where the real story of this storm begins. Because if the coronal hole is the source, then the thing that turns this source into a threat is something else entirely. Something that builds up as the wind races across the solar system. Something we call a co-rotating interaction region. Part 3. The CIR shock front. Picture a highway. Picture it at night. Long, dark, mostly empty. A slow-moving truck is rolling along at 40 miles an hour. Behind it, a sports car is doing 100. The sports car is closing in fast, and when the two meet, when the fast car catches up to the slow truck, what happens? The fast car has to brake. It has to decelerate. And if the highway is crowded with cars behind the sports car, all travelling at high speed, they stack up. They compress. The cars pile into a denser, slower, more chaotic zone of traffic. You get a wave, you get a front, you get a compression region where density and disorder multiply. That is what happens in space. That is, with some simplifications, what a co-rotating interaction region is. The scientists call it a CIR. The general public has never heard of it. But it is the single most important structure for understanding why a high-speed stream from a coronal hole actually causes a geomagnetic storm. Because the coronal hole itself, as we discussed, is just the source. It pours out fast solar wind, but fast solar wind does not slam into Earth. Fast solar wind cruises through the solar system at 600, 700, sometimes 800 kilometers per second. If that were all that was happening, the wind would just arrive, flow past us, and Earth's magnetic field would barely notice. The problem is that the fast wind is not arriving into empty space. It is arriving into the slow solar wind that was already there. The background solar wind, the ordinary ambient flow that comes from the closed magnetic regions of the Sun, typically moves at around 300 to 400 kilometers per second. That slow wind is already occupying the space between the Sun and Earth. It got there first, and now the fast wind from the coronal hole is chasing it down from behind. The fast wind cannot pass through the slow wind, not in any meaningful way. Instead, it rams into it, it compresses it, and at the interface between the two you get a region where density skyrockets, magnetic field strength doubles or triples, and the entire structure becomes a kind of rolling shock front that plows forward through the solar system. That is the co-rotating interaction region. That is the CIR, and that is what actually hits Earth. Not the coronal hole, not even the high-speed stream directly. What hits us first, what drives the storm, what causes that 12-hour leap from calm to KP6, is the compressed boundary zone between the slow wind and the fast wind. And the reason this matters, the reason this is so central to understanding what is about to happen, is that compression is what makes solar wind geoeffective. It is what gives the wind the ability to actually couple its energy into Earth's magnetic field. Because here is the secret ingredient. Earth's magnetic field is picky. It does not just accept energy from any old solar wind that wanders by. For the wind to really dump energy into our system, for it to produce auroras and storm the magnetosphere and all the rest, the magnetic field embedded in the solar wind has to be oriented a specific way. Specifically, the north-south component of that magnetic field, what scientists call the BZ component, has to point southward, down. When the solar wind has a southward BZ, its magnetic field lines can connect with Earth's northward pointing magnetic field through a process called magnetic reconnection. And that reconnection is what opens the gate. That is what lets the energy flood in, and a CIR is very good at producing southward BZ. The compression of the fast wind into the slow wind scrambles the magnetic field. It rotates it, it twists it, and in the process it often produces extended periods of southward field orientation, sometimes for many hours at a stretch. This is why the strongest initial storming from a high-speed stream event often happens right at the arrival of the CIR, not at the moment of peak wind speed. The fastest wind might come a day later, but the most disturbed magnetosphere usually comes at the shock front. The wave arrives, the compression hits, the field orients, the gate opens, and the storm begins. There is another factor that matters here, and it has to do with magnetic polarity. Coronal holes come in two flavors, positive and negative, based on the direction of the magnetic field embedded in their outflow. The coronal hole currently aimed at Earth is a negative polarity region. And negative polarity streams have a particular way of interacting with Earth's magnetic environment, especially at certain times of the year. When a negative polarity stream hits us in the spring, around the March equinox and into April, it lines up geometrically in a way that enhances its ability to cause geomagnetic disturbance. This is called the Russell-McFerran effect, and we will come back to it later in this story, but for now, what you need to know is that it is currently April, and the polarity is right, and the alignment is favourable, and all of it is stacking in the direction of a stronger than average response. The problem with all of this, the reason forecasters are not more confident about exactly what is going to happen, is that predicting CIR arrival is genuinely difficult. The coronal hole itself is visible, we can see it, we know roughly where it is and roughly how large, but the exact moment when the compression front arrives at Earth, and how strong that front will be when it gets here, and how long the southward BZ conditions will last, All of that is subject to significant uncertainty. The solar wind is turbulent. The interaction region is not uniform. The fine magnetic details that determine whether a storm will reach KP5 or KP7 are not things we can easily measure from 93 million miles away. And to make matters more complicated, there are problems with the tools we use to measure all of this. The spacecraft stationed at the L1 Lagrange point, about 1.5 million kilometers upstream of Earth, are supposed to give us a roughly 30 to 60 minute advance warning of what is approaching. They sample the solar wind before it reaches us. They tell us the speed, the density, the magnetic field orientation. But recent observations have noted anomalous spikes in the data, readings that do not quite make sense, signatures that may indicate instrument issues or may indicate something genuinely unusual happening in the incoming stream. It is hard to tell, and when your early warning system is throwing noise into your signal, your ability to predict exactly how hard this is going to hit gets degraded. So we know the stream is coming, we know the source, we know the structure, we know the general timing, but we do not know, with precision, how severe the peak will be or when exactly it will happen. And as we get closer to arrival, something else is starting to become clear. Something in the data. Something that suggests this particular event is going to do something very unusual very quickly. Because the forecast shift that is about to occur, the jump from a quiet magnetosphere to a storming one, is going to happen faster than almost anyone outside of space weather circles is used to seeing, and the speed of that shift tells you something important about how close to the edge our magnetic environment has been sitting all along. Part 4. The 12-hour flip. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and checking the weather forecast and seeing that in the last 12 hours the temperature outside has jumped from a calm, comfortable 65 degrees to a blistering 120 in less than half a day. No warning, no gradual build-up, just a flip. That is the kind of transition we're about to see in the geomagnetic environment. Not in the atmosphere you walk around in, but in the invisible magnetic sheath that wraps around our entire planet. The KP index, as I mentioned earlier, is going to leap from around 0.3 to something around 6 in roughly 12 hours. That is an almost 6-point jump on a scale that only goes up to 9. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the KP index is actually measuring. KP is a global average of magnetic disturbance, calculated from readings at 13 geomagnetic observatories scattered around the world. When Earth's magnetic field is quiet, when nothing is pushing on it, the needles at those observatories barely move. KP stays low, it sits near 0. It means that the space environment around our planet is stable, the magnetosphere is relaxed, and the electrical currents flowing through the upper atmosphere are minimal. A KP of 0 is the baseline of a calm planet. A KP of 6 is a magnetosphere that is actively being rung like a bell. The currents have amplified, the auroras have expanded, and the electromagnetic stress on every exposed system is orders of magnitude higher than it was 12 hours earlier. Rapid transitions like this, without a coronal mass ejection driving them, are not common. When a CME hits Earth, you often see a shock arrival, a sudden impulse, and within minutes the magnetosphere can go from quiet to violent. That is physics. That is a blast wave smashing into our field. But in the absence of a CME, in a clean high-speed stream scenario like the one we're in, the transition is usually more gradual. The CIR builds up, the wind speed rises, the field strength enhances, and over many hours the system slowly ramps into a disturbed state. What makes the current forecast notable is that the predicted KP jump is happening almost as fast as a CME-driven storm, despite the absence of the usual trigger. The system is responding like it has been struck, even though nothing has struck it. And that tells you something. It tells you that the magnetosphere was already primed. The 14 days of elevated electron flux, the preloading of the radiation belts, the extended period of slightly disturbed but not quite storming conditions, all of it set the stage. Earth's magnetic environment has not actually been quiet this whole time. It has been stressed. It has been carrying an invisible load, and when the CIR arrives, it does not have to do much work to push the system over the threshold, because the system has been sitting just below that threshold for 2 weeks, waiting for the smallest additional push. This is how threshold systems behave. You can apply stress to a structure for a long time, slowly, gradually, and nothing visible happens. The beams bend a little, the weld's grown, but from the outside, everything looks fine, and then one day, you add 1 more kilogram of weight, and the whole thing flips. It is not that the last kilogram was the problem. The last kilogram was just the trigger. The problem was all the weight that came before it, and that is what is happening here. The coronal hole wind is not the full storm. The coronal hole wind is the kilogram that tips the scale. Inside that magnetosphere, as the stress mounts, something called magnetic reconnection is about to accelerate. Reconnection is the fundamental process by which solar wind energy gets dumped into Earth's space environment. When the interplanetary magnetic field tilts southward and touches our northward magnetic field, the two fields do not just pass each other. They tear, they break, they reconnect with each other in new configurations, and each reconnection event releases energy, accelerates particles, pushes plasma. At normal rates, this is a low-level background process. During a storm, it becomes dominant. The rate of reconnection at the front of the magnetosphere accelerates, energy floods in on the sunward side, and on the night side, in the magnetotail, additional reconnection events fire off like lightning strikes, injecting charged particles toward Earth. What this looks like from the ground, if you are at the right latitude and the sky's clear, is auroras. But what it looks like inside the system, to the satellites flying through it, is a sudden violent reorganization of everything. The currents that flow through the ionosphere amplify. The electrical environment changes dramatically. High-frequency radio propagation, which depends on bouncing signals off the ionosphere, gets disrupted. GPS signals, which pass through the ionosphere on their way from satellites to your phone, get degraded. At high latitudes, these effects can be severe enough to knock out radio communications for hours. And as the KP rises, as the storm deepens, the effects expand to lower latitudes, to more systems, to more of the world. Now here is where it gets uncertain, because the forecast says KP6, the forecast says G2. But I have to be honest with you, the forecast is a best guess based on historical data from previous rotations of this same coronal hole. The models take what happened last time and project it forward. If the coronal hole has grown since the last rotation, which some observations suggest it has, the storm could be stronger than predicted. If the CIR compression is more intense, if the southward BZ holds for longer than expected, if the density of the compressed wind is higher, any of these factors could push the storm from G2 into G3. G3 is strong storm territory. G3 is when power grid operators start actively managing load. G3 is when airlines consider rerouting polar flights. But the forecast could also go the other way. The CIR might arrive weaker than expected. The southward BZ might rotate north earlier than predicted. The peak wind speed might fall short of the projections. We have seen events that were forecast to be significant end up being fizzlers. We have also seen events that were forecast to be routine end up catching everyone off guard. That is the nature of space weather. We know it is coming, we know it is going to hit, we just cannot say, with precision, how hard. And while everyone is focused on that 12-hour flip, on whether the KP will hit 6 or 7, on whether the auroras will dip into the northern United States, or stay locked above the Canadian border, something else is happening. Something that has been happening for the last 2 weeks. Something that most people covering this storm are not talking about at all. Because the real story, the story that connects all of this together, is not about what is about to happen in the next 12 hours. It is about what has been happening quietly in Earth's radiation belts, invisibly, without a single dramatic headline for 14 straight days. And the satellites flying through those belts have been drinking in the exposure the entire time. Part 5. The 14-day radiation event. While the forecasters have been preparing for the CIR arrival, while the KP predictions have been climbing, while the high-speed stream has been rotating into position, there has been a second storm unfolding in parallel. And this one has not made the news. This one is not flashy. This one is not going to produce auroras that you can photograph from your backyard. This one is happening in the outer radiation belt, in a region of space that sits between about 13,000 and 60,000 kilometers above Earth's surface, and it is measured in a unit most people have never heard of called PFU, or particle flux units. And since April 3rd, that unit has been telling a story that very few people are paying attention to. The electron flux above 2 megaelectron volts, which is the standard measurement for high-energy electrons trapped in the outer radiation belt, has been sitting above 1000 PFU for 14 consecutive days. Let me translate that. The outer radiation belt, which is one of two donut-shaped regions of charged particles that surround our planet, has been actively energized for 2 straight weeks. Energized to levels that cross the threshold at which NOAA begins issuing alerts for satellite operators. Those alerts, called Alt-F3 alerts, go out whenever this flux level is sustained, and they tell operators that their satellites may be at elevated risk of internal charging events. And those alerts have been firing repeatedly. The peaks have been impressive. On certain days over the recent stretch, the flux has climbed to between 1700 and 3200 PFU. That is significantly above the alert threshold. That is deep into the danger zone for electronics that have not been specifically hardened to handle sustained exposure. But the peaks, honestly, are not even the most concerning part. The concerning part is the duration. A short spike is something most satellites can shrug off. A 14-day marinade is different. A 14-day marinade is the kind of condition that slowly, relentlessly, invisibly, does damage that may not reveal itself for weeks or months. To understand why this is happening, you need to know a little about how the outer radiation belt actually works. The belts are not static. They are dynamic. They are a constantly shifting population of charged particles, mostly electrons and protons, that get trapped along Earth's magnetic field lines. Those particles bounce back and forth between the north and south magnetic poles, drift eastward or westward around the planet, and stay confined by the geometry of the magnetic field. But the population of particles in the belts is not constant. It grows and shrinks, it gets energized and it gets lost. And the thing that drives those changes, the thing that pumps energy into the belts or drains energy out of them, is the solar wind. When the solar wind is calm, the outer radiation belt tends to stay at moderate levels. When the solar wind gets active, especially when there are sustained periods of enhanced speed and variable magnetic field, something happens in the belts that physicists have spent decades trying to understand. The electrons in the belt get accelerated, their energies climb, the flux increases, and this happens through a combination of processes involving magnetic waves, resonance with those waves, and energy transfer from the solar wind into the trapped particle population. The exact mechanisms are still being mapped out, but the result is clear. Active solar wind conditions tend to produce elevated electron flux, and active solar wind conditions are exactly what we have been seeing. This is where the 14-day radiation event connects directly to the central story. Because this is not a random background condition, this is not just coincidence. The elevated flux we have been seeing is almost certainly linked to the series of solar wind enhancements that have been lapping against Earth in the lead up to this event. The coronal hole has been on the near side of the Sun for a while. It has been rotating into alignment, and as it has done so, the outer radiation belt has been responding to the changing conditions upstream, soaking up energy, accelerating electrons, building up a population of high-energy particles that is now sitting there waiting for the main event. And what the main event is going to do, when the CIR and the high-speed stream arrive, is modulate that population in ways that are hard to predict in advance. Some high-speed stream events enhance the belts further, pushing the flux even higher and intensifying the satellite charging hazard. Others actually deplete the belts, scattering electrons out of their trapped orbits and into the atmosphere where they are lost. Which outcome we get depends on fine details of the incoming stream, the density, the magnetic field structure, the duration of southward BZ. Without a clear forecast for those details, we cannot say for sure whether the radiation hazard will intensify or ease during the storm itself. What we can say is that the baseline has been elevated for 2 weeks. The system has not been given a chance to relax, and even if the belts deplete during the peak of the storm, they will likely re-energize in the days that follow, as the tail of the high-speed stream continues to flow past Earth and feed energy into the magnetosphere. Which brings us back to the central story. Because this is the pattern you should be watching for. Not just the dramatic arrival of the CIR, not just the KP spike, not just the auroras. The real story is that Earth is now operating in a condition where the radiation belts can remain energized for weeks at a stretch. Not hours, not days, but weeks, with every passing recurrence of the coronal hole adding another cycle of exposure. And the satellites flying through those belts, every one of them, are aging faster than their designers expected. That acceleration, that invisible degradation, is not a flashy story. It is not a breaking news alert. But it is arguably the most important consequence of what we are watching unfold. And every 27 days, when the hole rotates back into view, it happens again. Part 6. The satellite fragility problem. There are, at the current best estimate, about 11,800 active satellites in orbit around Earth. 11,800. That number is not a typo. A decade ago it would have seemed like science fiction. Today it is just the running total of what humanity has put into the sky and not yet let fall back down. Most of that growth has come from the explosive expansion of low Earth orbit constellations over the past several years. Starlink alone represents thousands of those satellites. OneWeb adds more. Amazon's Kuiper is ramping up. Chinese constellations are filling in their own orbital shells, and that density is growing. Every month more hardware goes up. What does this have to do with the coronal hole? Everything. Because those satellites are the systems that are being slow cooked by the recurring high-speed stream cycles we have been discussing. And the way they fail, when they fail, is not what most people think. Most people imagine a satellite getting blasted by a solar storm and instantly going dark, a dramatic death, a flash. That happens. But that is actually the rare case. The common case, the one that matters for understanding the slow stress of recurring coronal hole events, is a phenomenon called deep dielectric charging, and it is one of the strangest, most insidious ways that a spacecraft can die. Here is the mechanism. When high-energy electrons, the kind that make up the radiation belt flux we have been tracking, strike a satellite, they do not just bounce off, they penetrate the skin, they travel several millimeters into the internal structure, and if they hit a piece of insulation, a dielectric material inside the spacecraft, they embed themselves, they stop, they accumulate. Over hours, over days, over weeks of continuous exposure, the buried charge builds up. You cannot see it. You cannot measure it directly in most cases. The satellite looks fine. It operates normally. Its telemetry reports healthy values, but inside the charge is growing. The electric field across that dielectric is increasing, and at some point the dielectric cannot hold the charge anymore. It breaks down, it discharges, and you get an internal electrostatic discharge, a tiny lightning bolt inside your satellite. That tiny lightning bolt can do any number of things. It can flip a memory bit, causing a momentary error that the satellite might recover from autonomously. It can damage a component, degrading the performance of an instrument in ways that are hard to diagnose from the ground. It can short a circuit, taking out a subsystem entirely. In the worst cases, it can cause a cascade of failures that kills the spacecraft outright. And the timing of the discharge, this is the really insidious part, does not necessarily correspond to the peak of the storm. You can get a discharge days or weeks after the radiation event, because the charge is still buried in the dielectric, still building up from the previous exposure, still waiting for the final addition that breaches the threshold. This is what I mean when I say the satellite fragility problem connects directly to the central thread of the story. Because a single storm event, even a severe one, might produce a few discharges across the fleet of 11,800 satellites. That is manageable. But what we're talking about here is not a single event. It is a recurring cycle. Every 27 days, the coronal hole rotates back into view. Every 27 days, the radiation belts get energized again. Every 27 days, a new wave of high-energy electrons drives into the dielectrics of every satellite in a vulnerable orbit. And the charge from the previous cycle has not fully dissipated before the next cycle starts piling on top of it. This is cumulative exposure. This is chronic stress. And it is the kind of stress that modern satellite design, for the most part, was not optimized to handle. Think about the incident in February of 2022, when SpaceX lost 40 newly launched Starlink satellites in a single geomagnetic storm. Not because a solar flare vaporized them, because the atmospheric drag from the storm expanded the thermosphere, increased drag on their deployment orbit, and pulled them down before they could boost to their operational altitude. That was a dramatic headline-grabbing loss. Everyone covered it. But the quieter story, the one that did not make the news, is how many satellites have quietly degraded over time because of sustained exposure to events exactly like the one we are discussing right now. Satellites that still function, but function worse than they should. Satellites that report anomalies on a schedule that tracks uncannily well with solar rotation. There is also the problem of cascading failures. Modern satellites are not standalone systems. They are nodes in networks. Starlink is not just a collection of individual satellites. It is a mesh. Each satellite talks to its neighbours, relays signals through laser links, coordinates its orbit with the rest of the constellation. If one satellite goes down, the others can often route around it, but if 20 go down, or 200, the network starts to degrade in ways that are harder to fix. GPS is similar. The global positioning system depends on a constellation of satellites that must maintain precise timing to within nanoseconds. If the constellation loses enough satellites, or if the timing signals get degraded by ionospheric disturbances during a storm, the precision of GPS-based systems on the ground starts to erode. And GPS is used for more than navigation. It is the timing backbone of modern financial networks, of the power grid, of emergency communications, of essentially every coordinated system in the modern economy. What we do not know, and what we probably will not know for years, is how many near-miss incidents have already happened, how many satellites have experienced internal discharges that came within a hair of taking them down, how many components have been degraded to the point where they will fail in the next storm, even though they survived this one. Satellite operators do not publicly disclose every anomaly they experience. The data is proprietary. The incidents are rarely newsworthy unless they cause a major service disruption. And so, the picture we have of orbital fragility is necessarily incomplete. We see the failures that make headlines. We do not see the slow erosion that is happening below the surface, and every 27 days the cycle continues. The hole rotates back. The belts energize. The dielectrics charge up again. Somewhere in orbit, hardware that survived the last cycle is sitting a little bit closer to the edge of its tolerance, and eventually, for some piece of that hardware, this cycle will be the one that pushes it past the edge. We will not know which satellite. We will not know exactly when. But the probability is climbing with every rotation, and the probability of a critical failure, one that takes out something the world actually depends on, is climbing with it. Part 7. The compounding effect. What we have been describing so far, the radiation belts, the satellite charging, the geomagnetic disturbance, has been treated as a collection of separate processes. A stream hits the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere responds. The radiation belts energize. Satellites absorb exposure. Each of these is a chain of cause and effect, each triggering the next. But the actual physics of the space environment is not that clean. The system is not linear. The system is a tangled web of feedbacks, where the radiation belts interact with the geomagnetic storms, interact with the solar wind conditions in ways that produce responses which are, frankly, hard to predict. Let me give you an example. When a high-speed stream arrives, you might expect that the elevated solar wind would simply pump more energy into the radiation belts, pushing the electron flux higher and higher. That does happen sometimes, but it is not what always happens. In many high-speed stream events, the belts actually deplete during the peak of the disturbance. The electrons get scattered out of their trapped orbits by magnetic waves that are amplified during the storm, and they drop into the upper atmosphere, where they are lost. So the flux goes down, and then, in the days that follow, as the stream continues and the conditions stabilize, the flux rebuilds, often to levels even higher than before. Loss followed by recovery, followed by enhancement. That whole cycle can play out over 5 to 10 days from a single high-speed stream event, and it is not a small effect. The flux can swing by an order of magnitude or more. This is what scientists mean when they talk about non-linear response. The system does not just add up inputs and produce an output proportional to the sum. The system has internal states, internal feedbacks, and the response depends on the detailed history of what came before. And when you layer repeated high-speed stream events on top of each other, each one arriving every 27 days while the effects of the previous one are still unfolding, you get a system that is never quite in equilibrium. The radiation belts are always in some phase of being energized, depleted, or re-energized. The magnetosphere is always carrying some level of residual disturbance. Earth's space environment becomes, in effect, chronically disturbed, and that state, that chronic disturbance, is not something our infrastructure was designed around. Think about how engineering design typically works. You specify a peak load, you specify a failure threshold, you design the system to handle the peak load with some margin of safety. The design assumes that the peak loads are rare. They are acute events. They come, they go, the system survives, and in between the peak events the system gets to recover, to cool off, to return to its baseline state. This is how we design bridges, engines, airplanes, satellites. Peak loads are the enemy, but the system is assumed to rest in between. What happens when the peak loads stop being rare? What happens when, instead of occurring once every few years, they start occurring once every few weeks? What happens when the rest periods, the intervals of recovery, shrink below the timescale that the system was designed to recover on? You get cumulative damage, you get fatigue. In materials engineering, metal fatigue is a well-documented phenomenon. A steel beam can handle a load that is well below its yield strength if that load is applied once. Apply the same load 10,000 times, cycling on and off, and the beam will crack far below the static yield strength. The repetition itself is the damage mechanism. The cumulative strain accumulates in the microstructure, microcracks form, and the beam fails. Space-based infrastructure is susceptible to something analogous. Not mechanical fatigue in most cases, but electrical fatigue, thermal fatigue, software fatigue, in the sense that every anomaly that a satellite's software has to handle produces small changes in memory state, in component performance, that accumulate over time. And if the fatigue is accumulating faster than the system was designed to tolerate, you end up with failures that happen earlier than expected. Satellites dying before the end of their design life, constellations experiencing higher than expected attrition rates, services degrading in ways that the service providers struggle to explain to their users. The question I think we need to be asking, and the question that is largely not being asked loudly enough, is whether the infrastructure we have built in low Earth orbit, in medium Earth orbit, in geostationary orbit, is actually resilient against repeated coronal hole stream events over multi-year timescales. Because the models we have for predicting satellite lifetime are based on historical data. They are based on what happened to satellites during the last solar cycle and the one before that, in conditions that may not match what is coming. If the rate of high-speed stream events increases as the solar cycle transitions into its declining phase, which is what we will discuss in a bit, then the effective rate of degradation on our satellite fleet will also increase. And the lifetime projections we have been relying on could turn out to be significantly optimistic. This is the compounding effect. This is why the single event view of space weather, the view where you look at the KP index on a particular day and assess the risk, is insufficient. The risk is not in the individual event. The risk is in the pattern, in the cumulative sum of events, in the interaction between the state the system was in when the event started and the stress the event adds on top. And the risk grows with every rotation. Part 8. The Artemis Connection. I want to take a moment to pull back from low Earth orbit and look at something further out. Because everything we have been discussing so far, the radiation belts, the satellite charging, the geomagnetic storms, is happening inside the protection of Earth's magnetic field. The magnetosphere shields the atmosphere and everything in low orbit from the worst of what the sun throws at us. But humanity has started venturing beyond that protection. NASA's Artemis program and the various commercial lunar missions now operating around it represent the first sustained push back to the moon in over half a century. And once you leave low Earth orbit, once you cross the boundary of the magnetosphere and head out toward the moon, you lose the shielding. You're exposed to the full raw space radiation environment, and that environment is not just occasional solar storms. It is the chronic background of elevated electron flux and the slow persistent pressure of the solar wind itself. The same stream that is about to hit Earth is also flowing past the moon. The same radiation environment that is preloading our satellites with dielectric charge is also preloading any spacecraft operating in cislunar space. The question that has not been fully answered, and that the Artemis program is actively working to understand, is how recurring high-speed stream events affect human health on extended missions beyond the magnetosphere. Most of our data on space radiation exposure comes from astronauts on the International Space Station, which flies inside the magnetosphere and is largely protected. We have less data on chronic exposure outside that protection, and the data we do have from the Apollo missions and from a limited number of lunar orbiters was collected during solar maximum conditions, when the solar wind was being driven more by coronal mass ejections than by coronal hole streams. That connects back to the central thread, because if the solar cycle is transitioning toward a period when coronal hole streams dominate, as we will discuss, then the radiation environment that future lunar astronauts will experience may be qualitatively different from what Apollo experienced. It may be more chronic, less punctuated by acute storms, more defined by continuous elevated exposure. And the human health implications of that shift, particularly for longer duration missions of months or years on or around the moon, are still being worked out. What I want you to take away from this brief detour is that the recurrence of coronal hole events is not a problem that ends at the edge of the magnetosphere. It extends outward to every mission we send into cislunar space, to every astronaut we put on a lunar surface, to every deep space probe that will have to fly through the same stream every 27 days for the duration of the cycle. And the same persistence that makes these events dangerous to satellites makes them a factor in human exploration planning too. Part 9. The Recurrence Engine. Here is the piece that makes this whole story click into place. Here is the piece that transforms what we have been discussing from a news story about a single storm into something much larger, something much more structural, something that redefines how you should think about space weather going forward. The Sun rotates on its axis. It takes about 27 days to complete one rotation as seen from Earth. This is what scientists call the synodic rotation period, and it accounts for the fact that while the Sun is rotating, Earth is also moving around its orbit. So from our perspective, the Sun appears to rotate slightly slower than it actually does. 27 days, 4 weeks roughly, a monthly cycle written into the fundamental mechanics of our star. And that rotation is what turns a single coronal hole into a recurrence engine. Because the coronal hole is a structure anchored to the Sun, it rotates with the Sun. When the hole is on the near side, pointed at Earth, the wind it produces streams toward us. When the hole rotates around to the far side, the wind it produces streams into empty space, away from Earth. And then, about 13.5 days later, the Sun's rotation brings the hole back around to the near side again. If the structure is still there, and if it is still producing wind at the same rate, and if it is still aligned to send that wind toward Earth, we get another stream, another storm, another round of radiation belt enhancement and magnetospheric disturbance and satellite stress. This is what recurrence forecasting is about. Unlike coronal mass ejections, which are essentially unpredictable, high-speed stream events from persistent coronal holes are forecastable with a precision that would astonish someone who only knows about CMEs. You can literally look at what happened 27 days ago, check whether the coronal hole has persisted through its rotation, check whether the magnetic structure has remained stable, and project the event forward into the future. The recurrence is not perfect. Coronal holes do evolve. They can grow, they can shrink, they can fragment. But on average, over the span of a few rotations, they are remarkably stable. A hole that has produced wind for several rotations will probably continue to produce wind for several more. And that stability is what allows forecasters to talk about the April event, the May event, and the June event as part of the same sequence. Because the hole we're dealing with right now, the one about to send its stream into Earth's magnetosphere, has already been identified as a recurring feature. It was there in the previous rotation. It appears to have persisted through the intervening 2 weeks while it was on the far side of the Sun, and barring some dramatic reorganization of its magnetic structure, it will be there again in May, and in June, and quite possibly for several rotations beyond that. We are not looking at an event, we are looking at a schedule. Mark your calendar, the Sun has. And this is where the risk picture really starts to change. Because when you move from thinking about space weather as a series of isolated events to thinking about it as a cyclical pattern, the implications multiply. A satellite that has just been exposed to a high-speed stream event is not going to be exposed again for 30 days, maybe longer. Any degradation the exposure caused has time to stabilize. Any internal charging has time to dissipate. Any failures triggered by the event have time to be identified and worked around. The system gets a breather, but when the next event arrives only 27 days later, with similar or greater intensity, the breather has been too short. The residual effects from the first event are still present when the second event piles on, and with each recurrence, the residual load grows. This is how cumulative risk accumulates, and the risk is not distributed evenly across the fleet. Satellites at certain orbital altitudes, in certain magnetic latitudes, in certain design vintages, are more vulnerable than others. A spacecraft that flies through the heart of the outer radiation belt on every orbit, for instance, is going to experience the compounding effects of recurring streams much more acutely than a spacecraft that spends most of its time in a lower orbit. A spacecraft that uses older electronics with less radiation hardening is going to fail earlier than a newer, better shielded spacecraft. The population of vulnerable assets is distributed unevenly, and the recurring events are going to pick them off in order of vulnerability. And these recurring cycles can persist for a long time. The record books contain examples of coronal holes that have remained active for 6, 8, even 10 consecutive solar rotations. That is 8 months of clockwork storms every 27 days, targeting the same magnetosphere, compounding their effects on the same satellites. And while not every coronal hole persists that long, enough of them do that the pattern is well established. We have been observing this since the 1960s and 70s, when the Sky Lab Observatory first clearly imaged coronal holes in X-ray light and showed that they were persistent structured features rather than random patches. What has changed since Sky Lab is not the Sun. The Sun is doing what it has always done. What has changed is us. What has changed is the density of our space-based infrastructure, the degree to which our economy depends on that infrastructure, and the degree to which a multi-month campaign of recurring storms can erode the reliability of systems that modern life treats as perpetually available. The recurrence engine has been running the whole time. We're just finally building enough stuff in its line of fire to start feeling it. Part 10. Persistence versus explosion. I want to do something direct here. I want to put two things side by side, the way a courtroom lawyer might present two pieces of evidence to a jury and ask you to make a judgment about which one should concern you more. On one side, a coronal mass ejection. On the other side, a high-speed stream from a coronal hole. Both produce geomagnetic storms. Both can reach the G2 level on the NOAA storm scale, sometimes higher. Both can cause aurora, disrupt radio communications, induce currents in power grids, and stress satellites. By the standard metric that the public tends to care about, the G-scale number, they look similar. So why is it that CMEs get so much more attention, and is that attention actually warranted? Let me lay out the differences. A CME is, in essence, a solar explosion. A chunk of the Sun's outer atmosphere, a mass of plasma weighing perhaps 1 billion tons, is violently ejected from the surface, accelerated to speeds that can exceed 2,000 kilometers per second in extreme cases, and hurled across the solar system. When a fast CME is directed at Earth, it can cross the distance between the Sun and our planet in as little as 15 hours. It arrives. It slams into the magnetosphere. It drives a severe storm, and the storm typically plays out over a period of 6 to 24 hours. Then the plasma sweeps past. The storm subsides. The magnetosphere recovers. Total time from arrival to recovery, maybe a day or two. Maximum KP, sometimes as high as 9 in the most severe events. The Carrington event in 1859, the most famous solar storm in history, was a CME. A high-speed stream from a coronal hole is different in every one of those dimensions except peak KP. The wind is not ejected, it is streamed continuously, over a period of multiple days. The speed is lower, topping out maybe around 800 kilometers per second versus 2,000 or more for the fastest CMEs. The transit time from the Sun to Earth is typically 2 to 3 days rather than 15 hours to 2 days. The storm, when it arrives, does not slam the magnetosphere. It grinds against it. The KP rises over many hours. It holds at elevated levels for 1 or 2 days. The flux of energetic particles in the radiation belts builds over the duration of the event. The total stress on satellites measured in integrated exposure can actually exceed the total stress from a comparable CME, even if the peak intensity is lower, simply because the duration is so much longer. Here is the honest comparison. A CME is a punch, a high-speed stream is a flood, and your ability to cope with a punch, if you are a satellite or a power grid or a communication system, depends on having a margin of safety above the peak load. Your ability to cope with a flood depends on being able to drain continuously for the duration of the event. Those are different kinds of resilience, and modern infrastructure has been designed, historically, with more attention to the punch resilience than to the flood resilience, because CMEs were the events that drove the headlines. CMEs were the events that produced Carrington-class catastrophes in the history books. CMEs were the events that engineering standards and emergency response plans were written around. But high-speed streams produce storms at the G2 and G3 level routinely. In aggregate, over the course of a solar cycle, they probably contribute more integrated stress to space-based assets than CMEs do, and they are not rare. A major coronal hole can produce storm-level events every 27 days for months. Try to think of any CME-driven event that has the same persistence. There is a psychological dimension to this too. Humans are wired to respond to dramatic visible threats. A coronal mass ejection, imaged by the coronagraphs on the SOHO spacecraft, looks like what it is. A violent explosion, a billowing cloud of plasma, something you can see and point to and say, that is the threat. A coronal hole, by contrast, is a dark patch on an image that many viewers do not even recognize as significant. It does not flash, it does not erupt. It just sits there, quietly, turning with the sun, streaming its wind continuously. It does not trigger the same alarm response in the human nervous system. And so the media coverage, the public attention, the political resourcing, all of it skews toward the drama, the CMEs, the visible events. While the persistent ones, the recurring ones, the slow ones, go under-examined. This mismatch between the actual distribution of risk and the psychological distribution of attention is, in my view, the single biggest failure of how we currently talk about space weather. We are obsessed with the photogenic threat. We undercount the wallpaper threat. And the wallpaper threat, the coronal hole stream that comes back every 27 days and slowly erodes the health of our infrastructure over months and years, may be the one that actually takes something critical down. And we might be entering a period where the wallpaper threat is about to dominate the landscape entirely. Because the sun is changing, solar cycle 25 is maturing, and what it becomes next, in the years ahead, has everything to do with how the balance between CMEs and coronal hole streams is going to shift. Part 11. The solar cycle transition. The sun does not maintain a constant level of activity. It cycles. It has been cycling, as far as we can tell from historical records and sunspot observations, for at least 400 years in a roughly 11-year rhythm that defines the rise and fall of solar activity. We are currently in solar cycle 25, which began in December of 2019 when the previous cycle bottomed out and the new one started ticking upward. And that cycle has been an interesting one. It started weak, with forecasters initially expecting it to produce another below-average maximum like its predecessor. But as it climbed, it outperformed those forecasts. The sunspot count climbed higher than predicted. The rate of solar flares increased. The number of coronal mass ejections ramped up. And somewhere around the middle of 2024, or possibly a little later, the cycle appears to have hit its peak. I say appears, because pinning down the exact peak of a solar cycle is something you can generally only do in retrospect. You have to watch the activity for a couple of years after the apparent peak to be sure that it really was the peak and not just a plateau. But most of the indicators we track, the monthly sunspot number, the 10.7 centimeter radio flux, the rate of geomagnetic storms driven by CMEs, suggest that the peak is behind us, or at least that the peak is within the rearview mirror rather than still ahead. And that transition, from the rising phase to the declining phase of the solar cycle, is where the story of this particular coronal hole becomes much larger than a single event. Because here is the pattern, historically. The rising phase of a solar cycle, the climb from minimum to maximum, is dominated by active regions and the coronal mass ejections they produce. The sun is spotty, it is energetic, it produces flares, it launches CMEs. The magnetic field is tangled, chaotic, constantly reorganizing itself. Coronal holes exist during this phase, but they are typically confined to the polar regions, where they do not produce streams that are aligned with Earth. The geomagnetic storms during the rising phase are mostly CME-driven. The declining phase is different. As the cycle winds down, the active regions become fewer. The rate of CMEs decreases. The magnetic field begins to reorganize itself into a simpler configuration in preparation for the next minimum, and in that reorganization something specific happens. The coronal holes, which during the rising phase were confined to high latitudes, start to migrate toward lower latitudes. They stretch, they expand. Some of them reach all the way down to the equator, or even cross it, forming what are sometimes called trans-equatorial coronal holes. And when a coronal hole is positioned near the equator of the Sun, the high-speed wind it produces is ideally aligned with the ecliptic plane, which is the plane that Earth orbits in. Those equatorial coronal holes are maximally geo-effective. They send their streams straight at us, rotation after rotation, for months at a time. This is what the declining phase of a solar cycle looks like in terms of space weather. The explosive threats decrease, the chronic threats increase, the number of G4 and G5 storms goes down, but the number of G1, G2 and G3 storms driven by recurring coronal holes can go up. The overall rate of geomagnetic disturbance, measured over an entire year, can actually stay high or even climb, because the steady drumbeat of coronal hole events replaces the occasional CME-driven spikes. And if we are entering that phase now, if solar cycle 25 is really transitioning from its active phase to its declining phase, then what we are watching right now, this specific coronal hole stream on this specific date, might be an early indicator of the dominant space weather environment for the next several years. Not an isolated event, not a one-off. The opening chapter of a new regime where recurring high-speed streams become the primary driver of geomagnetic activity and the primary stress on our satellite infrastructure. That is a significant shift, and I want to be careful here because predicting the future behaviour of the solar cycle is genuinely hard. The sun has surprised us before. Cycles that looked like they were going to be weak have become strong. Cycles that looked like they had peaked have shown second peaks. We have gotten this wrong repeatedly. So I am not telling you that the next 5 years are definitely going to be dominated by coronal hole streams. I am telling you that if the cycle is behaving in the typical pattern, that is what we would expect. And the fact that we are already seeing persistent recurring coronal holes producing regular G2 storms is consistent with that expectation. For anyone operating in low Earth orbit, or planning to, or depending on the services that are delivered from low Earth orbit, that expectation needs to be part of the planning. The infrastructure that has been built over the last 5 to 10 years has grown up during a solar cycle that was still in its active phase. The declining phase is a different environment, and the longer it lasts, the more the environment of that declining phase becomes the new normal. Part 12. The Russell-McPherron Edge. I mentioned earlier that the particular polarity of the coronal hole stream hitting us right now, negative polarity, combined with the time of year, April, creates a geometric alignment that enhances the storm. This is the Russell-McPherron effect. It was first worked out by two scientists, Chris Russell and Robert McPherron, in the 1970s, and it describes how the seasonal tilt of Earth's magnetic axis relative to the interplanetary magnetic field changes the effectiveness of different types of solar wind streams at different times of year. Here is the short version. Earth's magnetic field axis is tilted relative to the orbital plane. That tilt, combined with the way the interplanetary magnetic field is oriented in the solar wind, means that certain types of streams are more effective at producing southward BZ at Earth during certain parts of the year. Negative polarity streams, like the one we are currently dealing with, are enhanced in the spring. Positive polarity streams are enhanced in the fall. The effect peaks near the equinoxes in March and September, and falls off as you move toward the solstices in June and December. We are currently in mid-April. That is past the peak of the Russell-McPherron window, but still within a period where the effect contributes meaningfully to geomagnetic activity from negative polarity streams. The storm we are about to experience is probably slightly enhanced by this geometric factor. Not dramatically, not enough to turn a G2 into a G4, but enough that the response we see may be a bit stronger than an identical stream would have produced in July or in December. This matters because it tells you something about how recurring events interact with orbital geometry. A coronal hole that has been active for multiple rotations is going to produce events that are all slightly different from each other, not because the hole is changing, but because Earth's position in its orbit is changing. The event in April gets a boost, the event in May gets a smaller boost. By June, the boost is gone, and the same stream produces a weaker response. And then by September, if the hole is still active and its polarity has not flipped, the positive polarity streams from related structures might start getting their own boost as we enter the fall equinox window. What this means, at the level of the central story, is that even a predictable recurring event is not the same event every time. The geometry modulates it, the timing amplifies or dampens it. And for any particular rotation, the system response depends on a combination of the stream itself and the orbital position we happen to be in when the stream arrives. This is one more layer of complexity on top of an already complicated picture. It is one more reason why long-term forecasting is hard, and it is one more reason why the April event in front of us right now is worth watching closely, because it is happening, during one of the geometrically favourable windows for producing stronger than average storms. Part 13. Infrastructure exposure. Let me turn from the Sun to Earth now and talk about what is actually at stake down here when a storm like this arrives. Because the whole reason we care about space weather, the whole reason NOAA issues forecasts and engineers build monitoring spacecraft and governments fund research into this stuff, is that the electromagnetic environment of near-Earth space is coupled directly to systems we depend on. And those systems have been multiplying. Start with GPS, the Global Positioning System, and its international counterparts like Galileo in Europe, GLONASS in Russia, and Beidou in China, are the backbone of modern positioning, navigation, and timing. Your phone uses it, your car's navigation system uses it, aviation uses it, shipping uses it, financial markets use it for time-stamping trades, power grids use it for synchronizing alternating current waveforms across long transmission lines. Emergency services use it for coordinating responses. It has woven itself into the fabric of modern society in ways that most people do not realize until it fails. And GPS is vulnerable to geomagnetic storms, specifically through the ionosphere. The ionosphere is a layer of the upper atmosphere, between about 80 and 1,000 kilometers altitude, where ultraviolet and X-ray radiation from the sun ionizes the air, creating a plasma. Radio signals, including the signals from GPS satellites, have to pass through this plasma on their way from orbit to the ground. Normally, the ionosphere is relatively smooth and predictable, and the distortions it introduces into GPS signals can be corrected for by the receivers. But during a geomagnetic storm, the ionosphere becomes turbulent. Electron density fluctuates. Structures called ionospheric irregularities form, and they scatter radio signals in unpredictable ways. The signals arrive at the receiver degraded, delayed, sometimes lost entirely, and the positioning accuracy, which is normally within a few meters, can degrade to tens of meters or worse. For casual users, this is annoying. Your phone's map takes a bit longer to lock on. Your rideshare driver arrives at the wrong corner. No big deal. For professional users, it can be more serious. Precision agriculture, where farmers rely on centimetre-level GPS accuracy to guide tractors along planting rows, can be shut down for the duration of a storm. Surveying, where positioning accuracy is critical, becomes unreliable. Aviation, especially precision approach procedures that rely on augmented GPS for landing guidance, can lose those procedures and have to fall back on older instrument landing systems. The costs add up across the whole economy. Move now to communications. High-frequency radio, the kind used for long-distance aviation communications over oceans and polar regions. For amateur radio, for some military communications, depends on bouncing signals off the ionosphere. During a geomagnetic storm, the ionosphere can absorb high-frequency signals rather than reflect them, particularly at high latitudes. This is called a polar cap absorption event, or more generally, a shortwave radio blackout. Airliners flying polar routes can lose their primary communication link with air traffic control and have to rely on backup satellite systems or reroute south to lower latitudes where the ionosphere is less disturbed. That rerouting costs money, it costs time, it uses more fuel. And during an extended event with multiple blackout periods, the cost to global aviation can be substantial. Power grids are vulnerable too, through a phenomenon called geomagnetically induced currents. When a geomagnetic storm disturbs Earth's magnetic field, the changing field induces electrical currents in long conductors on the ground, including the high-voltage transmission lines of the power grid. These induced currents, called GICs, flow through the transformers at the ends of the lines. Transformers are not designed to handle direct current, which is effectively what a slowly varying GIC looks like. The DC pushes the transformer core into saturation, which causes it to distort the alternating current waveform, which creates harmonics, which can overheat the transformer or cause protective relays to trip, or in severe cases, cause actual physical damage to the transformer. The famous Quebec blackout in March of 1989 was caused by GICs from a geomagnetic storm driving the Hydro-Quebec grid to collapse. 9 hours of blackout, 6 million people affected. That was a severe storm, G5 class, far beyond what we are expecting today. But the mechanism is the same. Smaller storms produce smaller effects, and the cumulative stress on transformers from recurring storms can reduce their operating life, accelerate their aging, and make the grid more fragile over time even if no single storm causes a dramatic failure. The high latitude bias matters here. GICs are much stronger at high latitudes, where Earth's magnetic field lines are nearly vertical and the magnetic disturbance is strongest. That is why Canada, Scandinavia, and the northern parts of the United States are more vulnerable than the tropics. Utilities in those regions have, over the years, invested in mitigation strategies. They have installed monitoring systems. They have developed operational procedures for managing GICs during storms. They have hardened some of the most critical transformers, but the investment is uneven. And in an environment where the frequency of storms is increasing, as the solar cycle enters its declining phase, the cumulative stress on the grid is going to climb, even if the peak storms remain below the catastrophic threshold. What ties all of this to the central story is the recurrence. Every 27 days, if the coronal hole persists, this cycle repeats. The ionosphere gets disturbed. The transformers heat up. The satellites absorb their dose of radiation. The cumulative exposure grows. And modern life, which has been built on the assumption that infrastructure is perpetually available, has to absorb that accumulated stress. What it looks like in practice is not a sudden catastrophe. It is a gradual erosion. Services that used to be reliable become occasionally flaky. Systems that used to last 10 years start failing after 7. Costs that used to be minor line items start compounding into significant budget pressures. The effects, in aggregate, can be very large. But they are distributed over so many systems and so many organizations that they are rarely attributed to their actual cause. Part 14. The collision clock. There is a related problem that space operators have been getting increasingly worried about, and that worry has grown in proportion to the density of the satellite population in low Earth orbit. Satellites do not simply fly. They have to be managed. They have to be tracked, predicted, and maneuvered to avoid collisions with other satellites and with orbital debris. And the ability to manage that fleet depends on systems that are themselves vulnerable to the same space weather that is threatening the satellites they are protecting. Here is the problem. Low Earth orbit is not empty. It is populated by 11,800 active satellites, as we discussed, and by a much larger population of debris. Space debris tracking organizations estimate that there are something like 30,000 objects larger than 10 centimeters that are being actively tracked, and perhaps 1 million objects larger than 1 centimeter that are too small to track reliably, but still large enough to cause serious damage in a collision. At the orbital velocities involved, around 7 to 8 kilometers per second, even a 1 centimeter object carries the kinetic energy of a large caliber rifle round. A collision can destroy a satellite, and each destroyed satellite produces thousands of new fragments, which then pose their own collision hazards. The catastrophic scenario that specialists worry about is the Kessler syndrome, named after NASA scientist Donald Kessler, who proposed it in 1978. The idea is that if the density of objects in low Earth orbit passes a certain threshold, collisions between objects start producing debris faster than atmospheric drag can remove it. Each collision creates more targets. Each new target increases the probability of further collisions, and the system enters a runaway cascade that renders entire orbital bands unusable for decades or longer. Kessler syndrome is not a certainty, it is a possibility, and most estimates suggest we're not yet at the threshold, but we're getting closer, and the threshold depends not just on the number of objects, but on how well we can keep them from hitting each other. Collision avoidance, right now, depends on a chain of systems. Ground-based radars and optical telescopes track the objects. Data gets compiled into catalogues. Conjunction analysis software predicts which objects might come close to which other objects in the near future. Satellite operators are alerted. Maneuver decisions get made. Thrusters fire, collisions get avoided. The chain has redundancies, but it also has vulnerabilities. The ground-based tracking systems are subject to ionospheric effects during storms. The data links between tracking centers and satellite operators can be degraded. The satellites themselves during a storm may be in safe mode and unable to maneuver, and if a critical maneuver has to be executed during a period when the operator does not have good positioning data, the consequences could include exactly the kind of collision we are trying to avoid. Recent studies have been looking at these collision probabilities, and the numbers are climbing. Some researchers have estimated that the probability of a significant collision in low Earth orbit over the next decade is substantially higher than it was a decade ago, driven primarily by the growth of satellite constellations. Space weather events that degrade tracking and communication are multipliers on that baseline probability. They increase the likelihood that, during a specific event, a maneuver will not be executed in time, or an alert will not be delivered, or a conjunction will not be detected. Connecting back to the central story of this script, the recurring coronal hole stream environment is exactly the kind of backdrop that increases this risk. Not through any single storm being dangerous enough to directly cause a collision, but through the accumulated pressure of repeated disruptions. Every 27 days, for the duration that the coronal hole persists, the collision avoidance infrastructure gets stressed. Every cycle, the probability of a miss becomes slightly higher. And over a multi-month or multi-year period of recurring streams, the cumulative probability of at least one near-miss escalating into an actual collision grows. That is how the collision clock works. It is not ticking toward a specific doomsday. It is ticking toward a probability threshold, and the recurring stress environment is making it tick faster. Part 15. Compound Earth Effects. I want to flag something that has been happening on Earth in parallel with the solar activity we have been discussing, and I want to be very careful about how I frame it. In several parts of the world over the past week or so, there have been significant severe weather outbreaks, tornado outbreaks in parts of the United States, unseasonable storms in other regions. None of this is caused by the coronal hole. To be clear, geomagnetic storms and terrestrial weather are not linked in any direct way that can produce a tornado outbreak or a severe thunderstorm event. The atmospheric and space weather systems operate on different scales and through different mechanisms, and the idea that solar activity directly drives our weather is not supported by the physics. But there is a concept worth introducing, which is the concept of compound risk. Compound risk is the idea that, in any given period, multiple stresses on different systems can combine in ways that make the overall impact on society greater than the sum of the individual impacts. A severe weather outbreak that damages power infrastructure in a particular region is a problem on its own. A geomagnetic storm that stresses the grid is a problem on its own. When both happen in the same week in the same region, affecting some of the same infrastructure, the total impact is not additive. It can be multiplicative. Repair crews are already stretched. Backup systems are already engaged. The operational margin that utilities normally maintain is eroded by the first event, and the second event finds them with less slack to absorb its effects. This is not to say that the coronal hole is causing the severe weather, or that the two events are coordinated by some external force. They are not. They are independent phenomena occurring in the same window by coincidence. But the experience of navigating both simultaneously is a glimpse into what a world of increasingly interconnected stresses looks like, and that world is not a hypothetical future. It is the one we are already in. The term for this is compound extremes, and it has been getting attention in the climate change research community for a while now. The basic observation is that as the frequency of various extreme events increases, the probability that multiple events will overlap in time and space also increases, and when they overlap, the response capacity of societies to handle them gets tested in ways that single events do not test. What this means for the central story is that the risk of recurring space weather events does not exist in isolation. It sits alongside the risk of extreme weather, the risk of cyber attacks, the risk of pandemic disease, and all the other stresses that modern societies have to contend with. Any of those risks on its own is manageable. All of them together, in the wrong combination at the wrong time, can overwhelm response capacity. The recurring coronal hole, by introducing a predictable monthly stressor on satellite and grid infrastructure, is one of those background layers. It is not the most dramatic layer, but it is there, it is cycling, and every 27 days it adds its contribution to the overall load that infrastructure has to carry. Part 16. Data gaps and blind spots. Everything we have discussed in this video depends on our ability to see what the Sun is doing. Our satellite observatories, our ground-based magnetometers, our in-situ monitors positioned between the Sun and Earth, all of them generate the data that turns into the forecasts that guide our response to events like the one currently unfolding. And that observing system, while it is the most comprehensive space weather monitoring capability humanity has ever built, has real limitations that deserve to be talked about honestly. Our best real-time monitoring of the solar wind approaching Earth comes from a small constellation of spacecraft at the L1 Lagrange point, about 1.5 million kilometers upstream of Earth. The main operational spacecraft there are ACE, which has been operating since 1997, and DSCOVR, which launched in 2015. Both measure the solar wind speed, density, and magnetic field as the wind passes them on its way to Earth. That gives us roughly 30 to 60 minutes of advance warning before the wind reaches our magnetosphere. That sounds like a lot, but it is not much, considering what we are trying to do. 30 to 60 minutes is the time between us seeing what is coming and us experiencing it. For satellite operators to put their spacecraft into safe mode, for grid operators to reconfigure their transmission networks, for aviation to reroute flights, 30 minutes is tight. And the L1 monitors are themselves aging spacecraft, operating well past their design lifetimes, and recent observations have reported anomalies in their data that may indicate instrument degradation. When the forecasters are telling us that they expect a particular storm intensity, they are basing that on data from spacecraft whose reliability is itself in question. There are newer monitors planned, NOAA's SWFOL. One mission is supposed to replace some of this capability, but the launch timeline has been slipping, and until it is on station, we are still dependent on the older generation. There are also proposals for monitors at other Lagrange points, particularly L5, which would give us a side view of the solar wind and let us predict events before they rotate into the Sun-Earth line. Those missions have been studied for decades, but they have not been funded for flight. If they had been flying during recent events, we would have had much more advance warning and much better understanding of stream structures before they arrived. But they are not. Beyond the real-time monitors, there is the problem of long-term modelling. Our understanding of high-speed streams and how they interact with Earth's magnetosphere is based on models that have been developed and refined over decades. Those models work reasonably well for typical events, but they struggle with the edge cases, they struggle with unusual stream structures, they struggle with predicting the precise timing of southward BZ intervals, which, as we discussed, is the key parameter for determining whether a stream will produce a strong storm or a weak one. And they particularly struggle with predicting the behaviour of recurring streams over multiple rotations, because the coronal hole sources themselves evolve, and the models have limited ability to anticipate how an individual hole will grow or shrink or migrate over a period of months. What this means in practice is that the forecast confidence for any individual storm is moderate at best. We can say, with reasonable certainty, that a stream is coming and that a storm will occur. We can give a rough estimate of the KP range, but we cannot reliably say whether the storm will peak at KP5 or KP7. We cannot reliably say whether the southward BZ will last for 4 hours or 14, and we cannot reliably predict a month in advance what the next rotation will do. The uncertainty is large, and it is not shrinking quickly because the fundamental physics of solar wind generation and interaction is still being worked out. This uncertainty creates blind spots. We know that recurring coronal holes are important. We know that they produce cumulative stress on our infrastructure. But we do not have precise quantitative models for how that cumulative stress plays out over multi-year periods. We do not know, with confidence, what fraction of satellite failures over the past decade can be attributed to recurring stream exposure versus other causes. We do not know, with confidence, how much transformer aging has been accelerated by cumulative GIC exposure. We do not know with confidence what the aggregate economic cost of space weather is, because so much of the impact is distributed and indirect. These are things we should know to plan properly for the future, and we do not. What this tells you is that the story we are living through right now, this recurring coronal hole event and its implications for the declining phase of the solar cycle, is being observed through a monitoring system that is not fully adequate to the task. We are making decisions as a civilization about how much to invest in hardening our infrastructure against space weather, and those decisions are being made with incomplete information. The decisions might be correct, they might be wildly wrong. We will not know for sure until the consequences play out over years and decades in ways that are difficult to attribute retrospectively. That is not a comfortable place to be, but it is the honest one, and the central story, the one we have been tracking through this whole discussion, is one where predictability and mystery coexist uncomfortably. We can predict that the hole will come back. We can predict that the stream will arrive. We can predict that the storm will occur. What we cannot predict is how our infrastructure will respond over time to the cumulative pressure of an environment we are only now starting to take seriously. Part 17. The psychological mismatch. Let me come back to something I touched on earlier, because I think it deserves its own focused look. There is a mismatch between the space weather threats that concern scientists and the space weather threats that capture public attention. And understanding that mismatch, I think, is the key to understanding why recurring coronal hole streams have been so undercovered relative to their actual importance in the media and in public awareness. Human attention is drawn to dramatic events. This is not a criticism. It is a feature of how human cognition evolved. In the ancestral environment, dramatic events were often dangerous events. A lion charging, a storm approaching, a fire spreading. These were the kinds of threats that required immediate attention, because they required immediate response. Our brains got very good at recognizing them and prioritizing them. The cost of missing a dramatic threat was potentially death. The cost of overreacting to a non-threat was just a little wasted energy. Evolution favored the alarm. The same cognitive machinery applies to modern threats, and it is why coronal mass ejections command attention in a way that coronal holes do not. A CME is a dramatic event. It looks like an explosion. It produces vivid imagery. It lends itself to headlines. The sun explodes. A massive blast heads toward Earth. Experts warn of auroras. The coverage writes itself. And the coverage, once it happens, reinforces the perception that CMEs are the primary space weather threat, because that is what the coverage is about. Coronal holes, by contrast, do not explode. They do not produce dramatic imagery. A coronal hole on a solar image looks like a grey smudge. It does not capture attention. A headline that says recurring coronal hole may stress satellites over extended period gets a fraction of the clicks that a headline about a solar flare gets. And so, the coverage is thin. And because the coverage is thin, public awareness stays low. And because awareness is low, political attention stays low. And because political attention is low, the funding and infrastructure investments that would improve our resilience against these events do not get prioritized. This cycle reinforces itself. This is the pattern of what I call slow disasters. It is the same pattern we see in climate change, where the gradual accumulation of risk gets systematically undercovered relative to specific acute events. It is the same pattern we see in infrastructure decay, where the slow deterioration of bridges and water systems and power grids gets less attention than individual failures. It is the same pattern we see in antibiotic resistance, where the emergence of resistant pathogens happens over years, while media cycles focus on immediate outbreaks. These are all phenomena that produce large cumulative harm over long timescales through mechanisms that do not lend themselves to compelling narratives, and our collective response to them is chronically undersized. Space weather in its recurring high-speed stream form fits this pattern perfectly. The events are regular, the effects are cumulative, the imagery is not dramatic, the stories are hard to tell without sounding like you are crying wolf. And yet the actual risk profile, as we have been discussing, is substantial. Every 27 days, a new cycle of stress lands on our orbital infrastructure. Every rotation, a new cumulative dose of radiation reaches satellites whose design margins are being tested. Every recurrence, the probability of a critical failure somewhere in the system grows a little. The psychological mismatch between the magnitude of the risk and the attention it receives is, in my view, the biggest obstacle to addressing it. If people thought about recurring coronal hole streams the way they think about hurricanes, as a recurring seasonal threat that requires planning and preparation, we would be in a very different place. We would have better monitoring, we would have hardened infrastructure, we would have emergency response procedures that specifically address multi-event scenarios, we would have insurance products priced with space weather cycles in mind, we would have regulatory frameworks that require satellite operators to demonstrate resilience against cumulative exposure rather than just peak events. We would, in short, treat this threat the way we treat other real threats. We do not do that, because the threat does not look like a threat to most of us. It looks like a grey smudge on a solar image, accompanied by an advisory most of us never read. Changing that perception is going to require something. A more compelling narrative, a more visible failure, a more concerted effort by scientists and science communicators to connect the dots between the smudge on the image and the consequences on the ground. Until that happens, we will continue to live in a world where the loud threats get attention and the quiet ones get overlooked even when the quiet ones are doing more of the damage. Part 18. The real shift in space weather risk. If you have stayed with me through all of this, you have a picture now that is substantially more complete than what you would get from reading a news article about the current G2 stormwatch. You understand that the event unfolding right now is not an isolated blip but a scheduled event in a recurring cycle. You understand that the damage mechanism is not just the peak storm intensity, but the cumulative exposure of satellites and grids to months of repeated stress. You understand that the forecasters issuing the advisories are working with incomplete data and aging monitors and models that have real limits. You understand that the declining phase of the solar cycle is about to amplify all of this. You understand that the infrastructure we depend on was not designed for this environment and is starting to show signs of the strain. What I want to synthesize now in plain terms is the shift that all of this represents. The traditional model of space weather risk has been episodic. Events happen, events end. In between, the system recovers. The risk is determined by the frequency and intensity of the events. This model is not wrong for CMEs. CMEs are episodic by nature. They erupt, they travel, they impact, they dissipate. Each one is a discrete event, and the risk is the probability that any given event will be severe enough to cause significant damage. The emerging model, the one that recurring coronal hole streams point toward, is different. It is not episodic, it is continuous. The events are frequent enough, and the intervals between them short enough, that the system never fully returns to baseline. The radiation belts never fully drain. The satellite dielectrics never fully discharge. The transformers never fully cool. The ionosphere never fully stabilizes. The environment becomes one of continuous low to moderate disturbance, punctuated occasionally by the acute spikes of CME-driven events. And in that continuous environment, the damage mechanism shifts from peak loads to cumulative stress, which, as we have discussed, is a fundamentally different engineering problem. Under the episodic model, you design for peak events, and you ride out the intervals between them. Under the continuous model, you design for chronic stress, and you assume that peak events will occasionally push the chronic load over the acute threshold. These are different design philosophies. They lead to different infrastructure. They lead to different operational procedures. They lead to different investment priorities, and our current infrastructure for the most part was built under the episodic model assumption. It is going to face its biggest tests under the continuous model reality. There is a version of the future where we adapt to this shift gracefully. We upgrade our monitoring, we harden our satellites, we build in more redundancy, we develop better models. The cost is substantial but manageable, distributed over years, and amortized across the growing space economy that is itself generating the value that makes the investment worthwhile. In that version, the recurring coronal hole streams become a known quantity, a factor to be planned around, and their impact is minimized. There is another version where we do not adapt in time. The recurring stress compounds faster than we reinforce the systems. Satellites fail at higher rates than expected. Constellations degrade. Services become less reliable. Critical failures occur that cascade through interconnected systems. The economy absorbs the losses, but the losses are larger than they had to be. And in the wake of some specific crisis, we finally make the investments that, in hindsight, should have been made a decade earlier. Which version we end up in depends on choices that are being made right now, by satellite operators, by grid operators, by regulators, by governments, by researchers, by communicators. The storm that is arriving over the next few days, this specific storm, this particular coronal hole event, is a small data point in that much larger decision. But it is a data point that fits a pattern. The pattern has been visible for some time. The pattern is getting clearer as the solar cycle evolves, and the pattern is asking us, in a quiet but increasingly insistent way, to take recurring space weather seriously. Part 19. The unanswered question. I want to return one last time to where this whole story started, with a contradiction, a storm warning without a storm, a coronal hole without a hole, a dangerous event without a single flash of light, the absence of drama that on close inspection turned out to be the drama itself. The danger was not in what we could see. The danger was in what was continuously, predictably, invisibly flowing out of the sun, rotating into view every 27 days, adding its contribution to a cumulative burden that our infrastructure was never really designed to carry. That is the shape of the threat we have been circling throughout this entire video. It does not announce itself. It does not make a noise. It does not light up the cameras or trip the sirens. It just arrives, does its work, and rotates away, leaving behind a system that is a fraction of a percent more stressed than it was before, and then comes back a month later to do it again. The coronal hole currently aimed at Earth will rotate out of view over the next few days. The stream will taper, the storm will subside, the KP index will fall back towards zero, the electron flux in the radiation belts will modulate, probably dropping from its current elevated levels as the stream passes and then rebuilding in the days that follow. By the end of April, the immediate event will be in the rearview mirror. The auroras will fade, the headlines will move on, which is exactly what headlines do. Coverage will shift to whatever the next flashy story is. A new celebrity scandal, a new political drama, a new CME if one happens to erupt. And the quiet, persistent, recurring threat we have spent all this time examining will slip back into the background where it has always lived. Unreported, unacknowledged, unchanged. And somewhere in the sun's corona, that same coronal hole, if it persists through the 13.5-day far side rotation, will come back into view on the eastern limb in early May, and the cycle will start again. That is the inevitability I want to leave you with. The event is going to repeat. It has repeated before. It will repeat again. It does not care about our news cycles. It does not care about our attention spans. It does not care whether we have built the monitoring infrastructure to track it or the engineering resilience to withstand it. It will happen regardless. The only questions are how long the structure will persist, how many rotations it will last through, how the geometry of the magnetosphere will respond over the course of those rotations, and how the cumulative damage will play out on the systems we depend on. Those are not questions we can answer with certainty right now. They are questions that will be answered by what actually happens, month after month, storm after storm, cycle after cycle. We are in the middle of the answer, and we do not know how it ends. That is a strange place to sit if you let yourself feel it fully. We are not watching a documentary about something that already happened. We are living inside the experiment as it runs. What we do know is that the shift is happening. The solar cycle is transitioning. The coronal holes are becoming more active and better aligned. The recurring streams are starting to dominate the space weather landscape. The infrastructure we depend on is being stressed in ways that our design philosophies are only beginning to catch up with. And the monitoring systems we rely on to understand all of this are themselves aging and imperfect. A CE is old. DSCOVR is old. The replacements are behind schedule. The models that translate raw solar wind data into useful forecasts are working with assumptions that were baked in during a different era of solar behaviour. We are navigating a significant change in our space environment with tools that were built for a different era, and we are navigating it in real time. That is not a comfortable position. It is not a position that lends itself to easy answers, but it is the honest position, and I would rather tell you the honest thing than hand you a neat conclusion that falls apart the moment you pressure test it. So the question I want to leave you with is not the one the headlines usually ask. The headlines ask, will it hit Earth? The headlines ask, how bad will the storm be? The headlines ask, will we see auroras at lower latitudes than usual? Those are interesting questions. They are the questions that get the clicks. They are the questions that produce the maps and the graphics and the evening news segments, with the presenter standing in front of a glowing graphic of the sun. And do not get me wrong, those questions have their place. If you're hoping to photograph the northern lights from somewhere they do not usually appear, you want to know the answer to those questions. But they are small questions, compared to the one that actually matters. They treat each event as if it exists in isolation, as if the only thing that matters is whether tonight's sky lights up. They do not ask what happens when tonight's sky lights up for the 30th time this year, on top of the 29th, on top of the 28th, on top of a decade's worth of cumulative damage that nobody was counting. The question that actually matters is about resilience. It is about repetition. It is about whether the systems we have built, the systems we depend on, the systems that underpin modern life, can absorb the grinding, monthly recurring pressure of an environment that is slowly but persistently stressing them beyond what they were designed for. Because one storm, even a strong one, is not usually enough to break a well-designed system. 10 storms over a year, each one arriving before the previous one has fully dissipated, might be. 100 storms over a decade, each one landing on a satellite fleet that is absorbing more cumulative radiation than its original engineers planned for almost certainly will. Somewhere in that sequence, on some specific rotation, a threshold gets crossed. A transformer that has been slowly degrading finally gives way during a storm that would have been survivable on its own. A satellite that has been charging up its dielectrics through cycle after cycle finally suffers the discharge that takes it down. A GPS constellation that has been losing redundancy one node at a time finally drops below the minimum coverage it needs to deliver the precision we have built our lives around. The question is how many it takes. The question is how close to the edge we already are. The question is whether we will see the failure coming, or whether it will catch us by surprise. And I think, if I am being honest with you, the answer to that last one leans in a direction most of us would rather not think about. Because the nature of cumulative threats is that they do not announce themselves before they arrive. They do not send a warning. They just reach their threshold quietly on some ordinary day, and the thing that was supposed to keep working stops working, and everyone looks around asking what just happened as if it came out of nowhere. It did not come out of nowhere. It came out of the 27-day cycle. It came out of the rotation before that, and the one before that, and the one before that, each adding its contribution to a load that nobody was adding up. So the real question is not will it hit Earth. That is the wrong question. That was always the wrong question. The Sun has been hitting Earth continuously for 4.5 billion years, and it is going to keep hitting Earth long after we're gone. The only thing that has changed is that we, in the last 50 years or so, have built a civilization whose nervous system lives in orbit. We have put our eyes, our ears, our timekeeping, our navigation, and our communications into a fragile layer of machinery, drifting through a hostile environment. We did that without fully accounting for what that environment actually does, and now we are learning in real time what it costs. The real question is, how many times can it hit before something breaks?